But I might as well kick it off now and thank everyone for joining us. So I think for the earth sciences and other field-based disciplines, we know that course requirements around fieldwork are frequently identified as a barrier to entry. And traditional field courses can pose challenges for students who might have financial limitations, or possibly carrying responsibilities, disabilities, or even just a lack of outdoor experience. So as enrollment in geology drops year on year across the UK and in many other places, we know there have been a number of conversations about whether fieldwork needs to be a part of a degree or whether there are alternatives that we can offer for those who might not be comfortable on a field course. But at the same time, fieldwork is a hugely valuable learning tool and has benefits ranging from improved spatial cognition, better problem solving, and just locking in the ability to synthesize different types of information. So were we to remove fieldwork or make fieldwork optional, we could actually end up penalizing students for their circumstances and possibly setting them up to be less successful in their career. So today I've asked everyone on this panel to join me here to explore whether instead of changing our course requirements, we actually just change fieldwork to make it more accessible and inclusive. So just to introduce myself, I'm Alicia Newton, and I'm the Director of Science and Communications at the Geological Society. And joining me are the amazing Jackie Hounton, Chris Jackson, Mike Pryor-Jones, and Luisa Zuluaga. I'll ask them to introduce themselves, but just so you know, we'll be taking questions using the Q&A box. So you can answer your question in there and everyone can upvote the ones they really want to see the panel ask or address. So please use that as much as you'd like. And with that, I'll start this in alphabetical order. So Jackie, if you could kick us off.
Right. Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to try and share my screen. This worked earlier. Okay, can you see my screen there, Alicia? Cool, okay. Right, so my name is Jackie Hounton. I'm an associate professor at the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. I first got interested in making fieldwork more inclusive, kind of by accident. I had colleagues starting to develop the virtual landscapes, which is the sort of top photo I've got there. And this was where we were using, it was designed as a training tool. We were using games engine software to create a virtual landscape that students could just, walk around, look at the geology. It's set up so that they can make notes and use the data to create a geological map and a cross-section across a made-up area. And via that, it got us starting to think about, well, actually, this can be quite useful. It's designed as a training aid, but actually we do occasionally have students who, for whatever reason, can't get into the field or can't fully participate. And that kind of just had a knock-on effect through in my whole interest in this area. I joined the IAGD, which is the International Association for Geoscience Diversity, got to know the people there and to see what they were doing in terms of accessible fieldwork. And as part of that, I was involved in what was a HEFKI project, embedding and sustaining inclusive STEM practices, led out of the Open University. And my role in that was to run an accessible field trip. We called it Access Anglesey. That ran in September 2018. And we had a group of about 26 of us all together. We had, I think, 14 students, half of whom identified as having a disability of different types. And we kind of experimented on them and with each other over a week, trying out sort of different technologies that could be used in the field and looking to see how, how valuable those were and what was, what were the most key things that we were picking up as really useful. And also at this time, I was working with Alison Stokes at the University of Plymouth. We were both members of the IAGD, and we said, well, we really ought to have a UK chapter for this, which is where the idea for Diversity in Geoscience UK, or DIG UK, came from. But we didn't just want that sort of same focus on disability. We wanted to be more diverse in our diversity. So we're still gathering speed. We've had been working very closely with the Geological Society. We've had meetings at Burlington House in the past. We're growing, we're on Twitter, Facebook, website is coming along, but we are trying to look at these sort of diversity, you know, in geology and the geosciences in a broader way as possible. There's kind of, yeah, I'm just thinking there's kind of quite a few things I could say. I've been involved with Chris. We're looking at applying for the Office for Students funding bid that looks at getting BAME students into postgraduate research and such like. So I've got a fairly broad background, but I think that's fairly nearly my 5 minutes up. So I will hand back to Alicia. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. And just a reminder, as you start thinking of questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. Chris, you're next.
Hi, everyone. I'll share my screen here, so hopefully you can see it. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is spend my 5 minutes giving you a case study of what you need to do, or what you can do, and the challenges and the barriers to trying to make geoscience fieldwork more inclusive. And it's going to be a case study of my involvement with as you see here, the ultimate cancellation of the MSc Petroleum Geoscience Oman field trip at Imperial College. And I'm starting the talk off with the press release around that cancellation, and the comment at the bottom: this change supports the college and department's commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion. So let's look now chronologically at the events leading up to that. So it was kind of triggered on the 29th of November when I kind of noticed this Stonewall Diversity Champion logo on another webpage on Imperial College, and it prompted me to send this email to the course director and ask the question, just kind of casually, quick question, should we be taking the MSc course to Oman given the laws regarding homosexuality? Notice there, there's an error in my understanding of the full nature of the challenges to our LGBTQ plus staff and students, but that was just how I phrased the question. Sorry for asking now, it's just been on my mind. You know, and then the week after that, after a series of meetings and email exchanges, there was a reply from, you know, I've kind of anonymized all this and changed the language slightly to protect people. But, you know, the response is we will continue to run the trip. The benefits of the world-class geological education, the taste of Middle Eastern culture far outweigh the potential risks, and as long as we can handle those risks. And you can see straight away there, an initial barrier to that is that geologically this is really important, and any thing which could stand in the way of the majority of the student body accessing that educational experience may be dismissed to allow the majority to proceed to have access to that. So instantly there's a concern there that there is a manageable risk, and it's worth managing that risk so that the majority can benefit. If we move forward then, the kind of response then from far higher in Imperial College was actually kind of more progressive and more encouraging and less, I'm going to say it, depressing, because there's a statement here that, you know, we shouldn't put people at risk without a risk assessment in place, especially when something is compulsory. Remember this field course, and oftentimes what we're saying to our student and staff body is that this is something you must do. Okay, so it's not an option. And you can logically think about what would come out of that if somebody's elected not to do something. And I'm going to come on to that in a moment. We should not force students or staff into a situation where they have to declare their sexuality. And that's a key thing in this particular case, isn't it? Because if somebody said, I don't want to go, that could be for myriad reasons. But one of the reasons, if you cast it in the light of this is one of the risks to you if you go, that is deeply, deeply problematic, isn't it? And I'm not queer, but I can imagine how awful that must be if you were to be forced into that and not elect yourself to do that. And, you know, college said themselves at a very high level that trips to countries like Oman should be reviewed. If we then fast forward to January, the field trip was made optional after much more dialogue. There was an offer of an alternative learning experience to drumroll Derbyshire. I'm from Derbyshire. Guess who was asked to run the field trip as the alternative learning experience? The person who raised the concern, which was me. I was asked to lead that in case any students elected not to go on the field trip to Oman. And they prepared a new revised risk assessment. And despite all of that, everybody tootled off to Oman and had a great time in the field, looking at no doubt some spectacular rocks. Let's fast forward to June. There was no email communication after the field trip until June, and then it was Pride Month, and I was sitting at my desk in lockdown in Pride Month, and I was getting increasingly agitated that nothing had gone forward. And in fact, what prompted me to follow up was the fact that in the prospectus for the following year, Oman was still there as a field trip to be ran for the students. Having prompted some people again, very high levels in college said arrangements are being made to avoid the risk. They're going to make the trip optional and develop an alternative learning experience. That email, I think, let me just minimize you. That email was on the 23rd of June, but by the 27th of June, 4 days later, the field trip had been cancelled. So this probably speaks to elements of the communication internally and the tenacity with which people were still willing to defend running this trip based on pedagogic reasons, despite manifestly there being a risk to staff and students. Notwithstanding the fact there's also other places you could go and look at these particular rocks in this instance. So that brings us full circle back to this press release and my tweet about this, which, you know, got quite a lot of attention. But then the big red flag, having read the press release, and I've hyperlinked it here, I'll put this talk on Figshare, is that there were still comments being made internally about the fact that this decision was a political one. So that for me is a big red flag that says, even if you're working quite hard to make these, this thing we care deeply about, and I care deeply about fieldwork, if we're trying to make it more inclusive and we're trying to adhere to our stated values, that some people will still simply see those decisions as being a political one to appease a minority of agitators. And that's not right, because our collective institutional stated values are something very different. And just to conclude, you know, you can imagine what happened after it was kind of made public, but this, I just captured 2 screenshots here to finish. You know, there are remarks by people saying this is very sad, less field experience for geoscience students is always a loss, regardless of the reason. So these are people who are struggling to understand why we should all have to suffer, or the non-queer people in this case should have to suffer because, I won't go into detail, but some of the suggestions that were being made to the LGBTQ plus staff and students about how they should conduct themselves when they're in certain countries were just were wrong, but also just morally quite repugnant. And also people who said, I've never heard of persecution of people based solely on how they identify. And you know, if people have that limited understanding of how the world works, that's difficult. And so that's my my slide. So I'm happy to talk in the panel about, you know, all aspects of that experience I had and to advise people on how to go about it.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. Mike, you're up.
Thanks. Alicia, the subtitles are coming through in Zoom, are they? Or are they coming, do I need to put them on in PowerPoint as well?
I think they're coming through Zoom.
Okay, just give me a second, I'll switch mine off then. I haven't used that before, so that's fine. Okay. So, yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm not a geologist. My background's in electronic engineering, but I've had an extensive field experience. I worked at the BBC originally. I worked on outside broadcasts a little bit, and then I worked for the British Antarctic Survey, and I spent 18 months living on one of their research stations. And overall, I've had 4 trips to Antarctica, 2 working for BAS, 2 working for an organisation that runs tourist trips called Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions. And then I've been in the private sector, and I did a lot of site visits, including this one for Sharp to install a solar power system on a nature reserve in the Seychelles. And then my current work is developing instruments for geology, and recently done field work in Greenland and Switzerland. And I will just sort of add that I really think that making a good environment in the field and working with good people in the field is one of the great pleasures of life, and I really want to make that experience work for as many people as possible. So a quick, my main point in this session really is about, kind of picks up from Chris's point, the Equality Act 2010, if you are British, means that a public sector organisation, and that includes a university, is required to meet the needs of people who have protected characteristics, where those are different from the needs of people who don't have protected characteristics. And this is a sort of legal language, but these are the 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act. Those are the terms that are used in law, not necessarily terms you would use yourself. But we want to make sure that we assess risk adequately based on people's particular needs. So in my case, yeah, again, picking up Chris's point, this is the ILGA map that shows sexual orientation laws in the world. Countries coloured dark red have capital punishment for same-sex behaviour, and countries coloured orange or red have jail terms for it. So that covers most of the Middle East, quite a lot of Africa, quite a bit of the Caribbean, and some of the Pacific Islands, a few places in Southeast Asia. And so if we look at the traditional risk matrix that I'm sure you've all seen if you've ever filled in a risk assessment form, right over on the laser pointer, right over on the right hand side here is severity death, and capital punishment is extremely severe, so we should try and minimize the likelihood of that happening. And that also applies in other circumstances. So if I send a group of black students to work in the field in a rural part of the southern US, there's a much greater risk of them being assaulted, carrying the risk of major injury or death, than would apply to white students. And so in my case, talking about as a gay man going to Saudi Arabia, in the case I was asked to go to a conference in Riyadh, that even though I would minimize the risk through my behavior, the big risk is actually that there is no real, you can't trust the judicial process. If you get stopped by a police officer for some minor infraction, they will look for things to stick on you. That's how policing often works. And so you can get falsely accused. My name's very distinctive. You can Google me. You can work out I'm gay quite quickly because I give a lot of talks at events like this. So if it's not necessary to go to these places, why take the extra risk? And if it is necessary, then you should take all the precautions you can. And my final point really is don't forget about personal protective equipment. If you are going to mandate PPE as part of a risk assessment, think about how it affects different people in different ways. Make sure that you can provide small and large sizes. You can get maternity fit workwear. An issue that's very few people seem to know about is that it is possible to buy what are called Asian fit or low bridge spectacles. So if you need safety spectacles or sunglasses, there are ones that better fit people with East Asian facial features compared with stereotypical straight-nosed people like me. So yeah, that's my final point. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. Now we're up to Louisa.
So hello everyone, I'm very happy to share this space with all of you. I don't have a set of slides, but I will tell a bit of my story. So I am a Colombian citizen. I completed a master's degree in France and a PhD in Norway, and both master's and PhD had fieldwork campaigns where I needed visas for. So I will share a bit some of my own experiences illustrating how nationality and immigration status can influence and affect my participation in fieldwork over all these years abroad. However, I'm here, so I should say I've been on the luckier side of this. Even though I will provide a glimpse into it, I am not necessarily a representative sample of many others whose visas got denied or couldn't even afford them in the first place. So that glimpse might also be a little bit relevant for those now holding UK passports after Brexit. You might need to be as patient as I have been on the passport line. I will also focus only on fieldwork related issues, but this quite easily extrapolates to, for example, careers in and that involves a bit of traveling, like academia, or in any career which international mobility is a valuable asset in your resume. So in my case, I have been very lucky that almost all my work and study related visas have been sponsored. I don't know how many of you know how much a UK visa costs. So for example, to give you some numbers, a 5-year visa for UK cost £655. And in comparison, a US visa that for my case, Colombians cost $200 for 10 years. So both numbers are quite significant for people. I have been also lucky that I was born in the capital of my country, because that means I could just go to the consulate or the embassy. Many people have to travel to the capital to apply for visas. And for instance, now that I live in Bergen in Norway, every time I need to renew my visas, I have to go to Oslo. So now I'm going to share with you a couple of anecdotes or things that had happened to me. First, while doing my master's in France, and second, while doing my PhD in Norway. So it's very common in Europe to do field work in another country. This is very nice, very good possibilities. In my case, I came to France with a French student visa, but the program had a field trip in the UK. I had the UK visa that I applied for it, but the French visa that I had was just an entry visa. I couldn't leave France until I got the visa transfer into a residence permit. So I almost got it in time. I almost didn't get it in time to go to field work. So even though I had all the visas, everything in place, you still cannot control the bureaucracy involved. And I was lucky. I was managed to go and look at all these fantastic outcrops in the south of England. But you can imagine how stressful this might be when one is first time moving abroad, learning a new system, learning a new language, all these things. Other experience that is not as stressful as the first, but is also quite annoying, is that a field course that is run by the University of Bergen that goes to that travels to the US. It's a fantastic field work as well. As Norwegians or Europeans, people get visa waivers. I had to get a full visa for it. Of course, my PhD project paid for it. That was very nice. But then when I entered US, I almost lost the connection flight. Why? Because I had to do the long queue, and also because I always get randomly checked. So it was very stressful because again, very lucky. I didn't manage to lose the connecting flight to Utah, but this type of thing it often happens. So with that, I think you can get a bit of a feeling on how much time, resources, and time, peace of mind goes into participating on fieldwork while a foreigner with a bad passport. Yeah, I'll be happy to answer a question, and I hope my story is of use to someone.
Thanks. And I feel the need to apologize for American airports and airport lines. Our bad on that one.
This is not, it's quite of, you cannot blame it on anyone in particular. That's the thing. It's just, yeah. It's not like Chris that he could do something about it, had some agency. In this case, it's kind of really, I don't know.
Yeah, I think both you and Chris made this really great point that geology is place-based. The rocks are where they are, and we can't move that terribly easily. So I think in planning fieldwork, if someone wants to take their students somewhere where it is safe for the students to be, how do you go about making that as easy as possible? Like, I'll start with Luisa. How could school or instructor better supported you in making that experience less stressful?
Well, I'm not sure. Actually, to allow for more time between connecting flights. Again, this is a type of thing that is really out of the control of anyone planning field work. It's maybe having a risk assessment. What happens if this random inspections turns into a 3-hour interrogation and things like that. So yeah, I mean, so far I've been in places where people is very understanding and supportive, but still I don't think people realize how much goes into planning and thinking and experiencing this. But yeah, one small thing would be like just to have more space in connecting flights and thinking about the possible repercussions in this regard.
Thanks. Chris, I've seen a lot of comments coming in. So are there other places that would be more amenable to taking this trip that can provide the same learning experience, or presumably a better one if people aren't worried about their own safety?
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's lots of limestones in the world, which just sounds very trite, but you know, again, you may have to recraft the learning objectives, and you may need to, yeah, there's a lot of logistical lifting to be done to plan and lead a field trip. So, you know, it is distressing for field trip leaders if a field trip is cancelled and then they'd have to redesign a new one. But you know, that's not the primary concern for me and others who were campaigning to have this removed. It's a shame, but if we have these as our stated values, as inclusivity being key to what we do, then we need to deliver on that. So yeah, there are, you know, you can go to Spain, you could go to Menorca, you could go to Italy, you know, there's lots of places. I think somebody made a comment in my DMs on Twitter. I was chatting to some people about this thing today, and they said lots of places have been quietly going about leading field trips in places that aren't hostile towards LGBTQ plus staff and students, and nobody's banging on their door saying, why are we not going to this other place? And I can see there's a question here from somebody saying whether we've had feedback from individuals that are affected by the cancellation. That's a moot point now because the whole of the MSc Petroleum and Geoscience has been cancelled anyway as of September this year. My concern is not, so two things. One is my job as a field trip leader is to try and design and lead a field course which is as safe and inclusive as possible. So that's my only concern. It's not to act as an advocate for, you know, a country to go there or to, you know, it's not a value judgment on that country or the peoples in it. The other thing is, I think in this Oman case, I'm not saying that somebody who identifies as queer shouldn't go to these places. People can go there on holiday, they can do what they want. Again, my job and my institution's job is to protect our staff and students. And individuals then can make any decision they want beyond that. I just don't feel comfortable. I don't think I'm making a decision for somebody by not leading a trip to somewhere which is dangerous for anybody.
Thanks, Chris. So Mike actually had a question for everyone attending, and I'm going to share that as a poll right now. And essentially it's, have you come across this new way, or the enhanced risk assessment? So I'm going to launch that poll right now and leave that up for a second. But Mike, can I ask you, what were maybe some of the responses or feedback that you were most surprised by when putting into place this enhanced risk assessment?
Okay, so just to clarify, Alicia, this was actually something that was done by colleagues before I joined the department, and but I'm going to turn that around and say that actually, as somebody coming into the department, the first time I was presented with this form, it's very rare in university life to be excited about a form, but actually I really was, because I was like, hang on a minute, I've never seen this before. This is really good. This is a really useful aid to thinking. So yeah, I think people are certainly within the department are now very clued up about it. And it was very interesting. Part of the reason I come to be involved in this is that I saw on Twitter people talking about compulsory geology field trips, and other institutions being difficult about risk assessments. And I sent 1 or 2 people Cardiff's risk assessment as a way of saying that they could take to their management and say, hey, this is not that radical. Another university is already doing this. And so based on that, I was then, with colleagues, wrote a short paper about it at European Geoscience Union last year.
And so the results of that poll suggest that the majority of people don't have this in place, but at least there are some institutions that have some protections. So it looks like we're hopefully going in the right direction there. And, you know, as we share this webinar, and I think there'll be a lot of writing up to come out of this, hopefully that can be something that can get picked up more.
Yeah, I was quite shocked when I dug into this to discover this is actually the law. You are, if you're in a public institution, you're actually required to do this. and because I'd spent 10 years in industry, I'd largely missed that. But yeah, that's it's still quite shocking that it's not caught on more.
Yeah. Jackie, I'm going to come to you, and we have a question that's, I grew up in the city and didn't discover a passion for outdoor activities and fieldwork until I was introduced to it through my college geoscience courses, and this could be me writing it as well. And so do you have any suggestions on how to welcome and encourage participation from people who might not be as outdoorsy? And I know that your field trip in Anglesey took so much of this into account to a really great effect. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I was going to say perhaps part of the thing is getting people involved and interested in, you know, the geosciences, you know, so that they do come to university, you know, because I mean, that's the sort of point of view I'm sort of speaking from is, you know, working within the university. I mean, from the field trip that we did, we've started to use some of what we learned, well, I mean, talked around different places about what we've done, but what we're doing at Leeds now is introducing where we know, and it starts off with where we know that a student has identified that they may have difficulty with field work, usually through a sort of formal process of, you know, they're signed on with our disability services, you know, yeah, our disability services people, that we have a chat with the student, just a quiet one-to-one, to find out how they feel about it, and we take, you know, how they feel about field work. And a lot of students do want to do field work, but they can see that they're going to have difficulties or perceived difficulties. So we've set up a system where we meet up with the fieldwork leader, teaching assistant or demonstrator from that field trip with the student beforehand, and we have a good chat about the field trip, about what to expect, about what we can do for them, because we can always do more for students than students often realise. We talk about the accommodation, what food that they're going to, you know, whether they can, you know, cook themselves or if they have special dietary requirements. And we just sort of sit and have a casual chat around the whole of the field trip. We introduce them to the demonstrator as a contact, so that when they're in the field, they know they've got somebody. You know, obviously they can talk to the field trip leaders as well, but they've got somebody they can just sidle up to quietly and have a chat with, you know, if they're not sure about something. And the idea with that is you do have somebody who is concerned about field work, but they do have to let us know that we can have this more detailed chat with them. We started this process just before everything got shut down with COVID. So it was just over a year ago, because from the meetings that I did, it quickly became obvious that it'd be really good to offer this to a wider group of people as well. That actually we should be having these conversations about, well, what is the accommodation like? I mean, in details, not just who you're going to share with. What is the food like there? How, you know, can they deal with different dietary requirements? You know, do you have to climb the stairs to get to the, you know, room where you do the teaching? This kind of thing. So it was something that we were starting to put into place. And something that came from the Access Anglesey trip that we ran was that communications were key. Letting people know what to expect on the field trip went a huge way towards reducing anxiety around, because it's, we all know it, fear of the unknown, you know, not sure what to expect. And so that's kind of how we've been dealing with it, is trying to really up for communications about the field work that we do. So I'm not sure if that's really answered the question or if I've gone off on a complete sidetrack, but yeah, that's about trying to make fieldwork more accessible just in a very simple way, by reducing anxiety with really detailed communication around a particular trip.
Thanks, it's really helpful. And I think a few questions have come in now on so you don't want to ask students necessarily to identify every single thing about themselves. So how do you start from the beginning in planning a field trip to make sure it's inclusive? And Mike, I might let you take this one first. And then...
Okay, yeah, so I really want to echo Jackie's point that planning ahead and communicating ahead, it would be my recommendation. And you know, you can go a long way in terms of saying, this is what we're planning to do, giving as much detail as possible, and then being responsive and sharing your plans with as many people as you can, particularly people who may have a different perspective. Make use of your student union, your LGBTQ network, those sorts of people, and just say, this is something we're planning to do, can you help? I don't know a whole lot about accommodation for people with physical disabilities, but there's a lot you can do. People are used to managing themselves in the wider world, and as long as they know what's going to happen. Thanks.
Great. Did anyone else want to jump in on that as well? Because I think it's a question for everyone, really.
Sorry, I was answering a question in the chat. Sorry.
Great. I think this is something that's coming up too, and Chris, I'll just go back to you because I know we've had this conversation in the past, is how can we start to address the financial point of view, thinking about gear, travel, accommodation, initial payouts or layouts, visa fees? How do we start to do that?
Well, there's a couple of comments in the chat. I think there's Catherine Goodenough and Jules Mecklenburg have touched on this. And I think Catherine made the point about, you know, where we choose to go. Whether, you know, in the UK, we have, you know, a bewildering array of amazing rocks to go and look at. And okay, they might not be as juicy to put on a prospectus to attract lots of students to boost our admissions, but we can fundamentally meet the learning objectives as required by, let's say, the Geological Society's requirements for accreditation. So we can do that, and that's one way of lowering the cost for people, is by looking more locally, and that then allows us to align with maybe some environmental concerns or sustainability concerns as individuals, as institutions we may have. I think related to that is Jules's point in the chat, which is regarding when we go, because if we go on much longer trips, we often run those in vacation and holiday times, and that for me is hugely problematic from a socioeconomic point of view, in that you're asking students to forego income. So I used to work every holiday when I was at university because my parents were both nurses. And so, you know, if I was required to go away and miss chance to earn money, that would have been very difficult for me from a financial point of view. So I think they're big ticket items, and then there's all the other things like field equipment as well. And there's a paper which came out 2 weeks ago, I think the preprint came out about this by, I think it was Angeli Fernandez and Robert Mann were co-authors on that paper with some others, calculating the cost of field gear. And so one way we can try and address that is potentially by getting like upcycling of field gear. So field gear is held by the department and passed between students. There's an end of degree sale of material on. There's kit lists put together from in the UK Decathlon where you can get relatively good quality, low price equipment. So we provide more assistance to people to lower the clothing and the equipment barrier that might face them.
Great. I think I might pick on Louisa and Jackie with this one, because I know for me as a woman and being plus sized, finding field equipment that works for me is not the easiest and it's not the cheapest. And I guess picking on us, how do we start to go about helping other women or other men who are not the standard field geologist size to kit themselves out? Things we can do.
I tend to buy in kids size.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a really tricky one. Yeah, the field gear choice isn't always that great. It never seems cut, even though there's clothes that are said there for women, never seem cut for women. I don't know. I can only assume that to a large extent it may be men that design the field gear, but I don't know for certain, and there may be broader ranges that I don't know about. I tend to end up in leggings, to be honest, because they're kind of stretchy and they dry quick, and that in the field. So it's, I mean, I would say that from a female point of view, actually, the bigger issues are, you know, around whether there's facilities, whether there are toilets available and that kind of thing, because particularly, I mean, for somebody like me, I'm used to it. I've been in the field, not a problem, but we have students, you know, for whom, you know, culturally, potentially as well, it's just, you know, what can we arrange, you know, what can be in place. And it's, I think, even if you're just starting with the awareness of that, because we do go to remote places, but we were talking there about planning field trips, and it is just thinking of that as well, I think, particularly from a female point of view, where it's not a case of finding a tree.
Great. So we've had a really good question come in, and we're asking field trip leaders to actually take on a lot more thought and responsibility for student well-being. So how do we ensure that they have the adequate training and support they need to really help their students in the field? I'll open that to anyone who wants to jump in.
I was going to say one of the things actually I think is training for field trip leaders. We've talked about this both in Leeds, and I've talked, you know, with other people, and there's a lot of concern about whether we are able to safely support students who may have, you know, particular needs in the field. And as you say, we're taking on a lot. You're looking at risk assessment and such like. And it's about, yeah, trying to offer training so staff feel, I mean, the classic one we've got is to feel comfortable with dealing with mental health issues that may only come out in the field. And sometimes that is where they come out because of the extra stresses involved. And we're set up, and I know other places have done as well, because we all get sort of physical first aid training, but it's, you know, mental health first aid training in a safe environment where actually staff can ask questions that you might not want to ask, you know, almost in public, if you like, and just have a sort of honest conversation about how do we deal with this. So I'm distracted. Oh, my camera's moved around, it's thrown me completely, sorry. Yeah, and it's about being able to have that training, but about being able to have safe conversations, and about departments supporting staff, you know, financially. You may well need more staff on a field trip. You know, if you have a wheelchair user on a field trip, you will need, you know, somebody to drive a 4x4 so they can get up to the outcrops. But that is an extra person on a trip sometimes. So I think a lot of it's about support. See, Chris, I think, has his hand up, so I'll stop talking.
No, I just wanted to pick up on your point about safe conversations. There's a couple of people in the chat saying exactly this point. And I think, you know, how oftentimes things come out in the field when it's a live situation, and it is deeply traumatic for everybody involved. And I've been involved in some of the most horrendous situations in the UK and abroad where if I'd have known about something before, everybody would have dealt better with the situation. So how do we make that happen? I think one thing we really need to fight for is to build trust with the student body, way ahead of going in the field. So if they feel that they're in inclusive and diverse departments ahead of time, and there are regular conversations about diversity and inclusion, and we tackle this across the curriculum, then it's more likely students, when afforded the opportunity with enough time ahead of going in the field, to come forward with something which is, you know, they might not readily want to share. It's more likely that they will share that. And so I think it speaks to a lot of the problems we have at the moment in a broader sphere of across the broader sphere of geoscience, about that you know, the staff student relationship and how we make it work better to everybody's advantage. So rather than, you know, this whole like trauma, there's some people in the chat talking about, you know, this idea that students need to be, I think Irina from Plymouth was talking about, you know, traumatizing students in the field, and you know, I did it the hard way and you have to. Like, none of that's going to help you in the long run as a field trip leader. It's like, just understand that, and then everything will be better for everybody.
Yeah, I think what Chris says is very important about establishing trust, because there was also something that happened while I was studying, not to me personally, but some of the field work was done under Ramadan, and the students who were Muslims were very, very tired. And field work is a very physically demanding thing, usually, and for them, it was very, very difficult to both observe Ramadan and be fully present on the field. So, yes.
Yeah. I guess that kind of goes to, if there's no one at the coordinator level who would think of that, then no one's there to support it and identify it in the students. And I think so many people have mentioned just, we actually need a diverse group of people to plan ahead, to put these risk assessments in. And in fact, I think I'm seeing a huge role for Dig UK and the Geological Society in putting resources together. So sorry, Jackie, more work for the website.
No, that's absolutely fine. It's a work in progress. So as soon as we finish this teaching semester, the only problem we have with Dig UK is it currently, and this is something we'd like to expand on, it is largely run by academics, which means, of course, we've all just disappeared under the online teaching, yes, I'll say constraints, issues in the last few months. So everything's slightly ground to a halt, but hopefully in a couple of months we will be back online. And one of the things we're really looking to is to provide resources, because I think these conversations that we're having here are going on in many different places. I've had, you know, similar conversations on other, you know, sort of discussion groups, workshops, both here and abroad. So I think it's very much a big issue, you know, an issue that's growing. So at Dig, we will do our best to get some stuff up on the website in the next few months. We will give you lots of help
to do that as well. So, your team effort. Yeah, I saw a really good question about physical fitness and physical abilities. And I think certainly I did my major field camp coming off of a huge medical issue. So that was a struggle for me when we're up in the Rocky Mountains and the air is very thin. So how do we start to think about that? There's this sense of, I must climb to see this outcrop, but can we build something a bit more inclusive in? And I might, pick on Mike, because you're nodding along here.
I clicked in the wrong window. So yeah, thank you, Alicia. I would say I'm well aware that 2020 has taken its toll on me, and I was in the field in August, very briefly, in the sort of brief window you could get out of the country, walking up a glacier in Switzerland, dragging 30 kilos of equipment, and that was again a classic. We should have planned ahead. Two things. One, so should have planned ahead. I did want to get the equipment shipped to my Swiss colleagues who would have had it delivered to the site along with their equipment, which was being delivered by helicopter. Because I was on furlough, because the university was in chaos, the field trip wasn't authorized until really the very last minute. That meant that I was, you know, dragging all my equipment up and down the glacier. So plan ahead, plan ahead, plan ahead. It really is the big thing. And I'm going to sort of pick up a little point from Jackie and Chris earlier. Discrimination is really cheap, and that's unfortunately, whilst a lot of the time you can get around things by just being a bit more organized and a bit more aware of what's going on, sometimes it does actually cost extra money to be inclusive.
Thanks. So yeah, a lot of the no toilet breaks has come up once again. So I think we can shout out to the University of Birmingham resource on planning and communicating toilet breaks. So important for everyone, and just, yeah, planning schedules, making sure people know what to expect. I don't think we can repeat that enough, probably. And then this is a really good question in that, so this is in many cases a student well-being issue. So are we able to actually work with the well-being services to support on field trips, to support, and how would you start to go about doing that if you don't know in your university?
I would just make a comment there. Sorry, somebody made a comment in the chat related to that and said, I don't know if it was the same comment, Alicia, as you saw, but we have fieldwork first aid for broken legs and mosquito bites and scorpion stings and such like, but do we have anything which would prepare us for physical violence against Black staff or students, or a police officer stopping somebody, like in the case Mike gave you, who has a Kindle with same-sex literature on, for example? Like, are we prepared to deal when we're in these countries with those challenges? And from my experience, clearly we are so far away from being ready to deal with those experiences. It's terrifying, and that's why things like Amman, in my view, should have stopped. But there probably is an opportunity, isn't there, to kind of train people. So we've got to mental health first aid training, I think, now in most departments. We have mental health first aiders, but maybe there's a step beyond that for field work where we would have mental health first aiders come into those settings in the fieldwork first aid and talk about mental health first aid in the field. But then that would allow you to tap into things like, well, there's these other threats to protected people with protected characteristics, which have these specific needs because of these specific risks. So I think that's a really exciting thing for the future. And I think most universities have that resource already in it. It's a case of linking it up to the geoscience departments, perhaps.
Yeah, I think as an American, the thought of a police stopping a group of foreign students is chills of how badly that could go, depending on where you're located. And it's, something I think we have to think about even more. So I will talk about, one thing we've been talking about are the student learning field trips, but at the same time, geology is where the rocks are, and there's some mandatory research that might be needed for a research project, PhD. How do we make that as safe as possible? And might start with Louisa, if you can jump in.
Sorry, I was just a bit distracted reading all the questions in the chat.
Oh no! So I was thinking, so mandatory research, so research you might have to do for your PhD. How do we start, because that's less optional and more place-based, how do universities, other researchers, and even grant-making agencies possibly start to support that?
So I think if there's an awareness, I do have to do some risk assessment matrices in all my fieldwork campaigns. And so that was, it's not the most fun thing to do, but when you need it is going to be very valuable. So doing that thing. Also, in my particular case, maybe account for the visa fees in the grant money. This type of thing. And so I know there's a lot of possible things to improve upon, and of course people do the best they can, and I think if there's an open conversation, it slowly goes into maybe improve things and make things easier for everyone to be fully present and take advantage of field work. That's about it.
Did anyone else want to jump in on that? Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it is really valuable to think about one of my big frustrations as a postdoc is that the people write grants in a terrible hurry, and they cost them in a terrible hurry, and they often cost them badly. And who bears the brunt of your undercosted project? It's your postdoc and your PhD student, who are out there dragging stuff up against the wall with not enough money on not enough food. I'm not criticizing my current PI, who's great, but I've heard a lot of other terrible stories. And I think one of the things the funding agencies could do is be more rigorous when people put their budgets in. I've just submitted a grant application which has come back with people saying, yeah, it looks fine. There's no grant writing toolkit that tells you how much to budget for doing some of this stuff. It would be really great to have some collective knowledge about how much does it cost to hire a fixer in, you know, rural Africa? How much does it cost to hire a helicopter in Greenland? And what are the additional things you ought to think about when you're going to these kinds of places? I know some of the professional organizations are getting quite good at this, but it would be really good for the funding agencies to be more rigorous about ensuring that budgets are adequate for the work that's proposed.
I was just going to make a comment there, Mike. You know, we have this thing like, will this research project like involve the use of live animals or torturing like small creatures, right? We should also have a box where you have to tick, will this research project pose a manifest risk to people with protected characteristics? And if you can't tick that box and you can't cost sensibly to provide those protections.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but it's also a broader point that, you know, people get stretched when there's not enough money in the system. And it would also be great, I think something that the universities could do, and again, maybe with some support from UKRI, is to provide an accommodations fund, which I'm sure they do to some extent already for people's hiring. But, you know, if I hire somebody to work on my grant, and they turn out they're a great person, but they need additional costs for accommodations, and I've not pre-costed that in my grant, where's that money coming from? I've got to beg nicely to the university saying, please, can I have more money? Or I've got to take it out of something else that I'm then going to not do.
Interestingly, the money question has come up again in the chats, and you end up with extra staffing or bespoke catering when you have food allergies or intolerances. So yeah, we need to work together as a community to argue for more resources and find them. I guess this is the dreaded, it's a comment, not a question, but to turn that around, how can we organize as a community to actually do this? Jackie, as an organization founder, do you want to jump in? Co-founder?
I was going to say something slightly different. Some of this comes under reasonable adjustments, which is a legal thing. So for for many of the things that have come up, we are legally required. The fieldwork is compulsory as part of accreditation. Therefore, it's to do with professional standards. We need to be able to take students on field trips. We need to be able to make all reasonable adjustments necessary for them to participate. And therefore we're obliged to pay for many of these things. I appreciate that's not straightforward, with money situation, for everybody really across the board. But that is, the line of argument I've used more than once, is that we do have a legal obligation to make these reasonable adjustments. So, I mean, that's not quite answering your question, but that would be my response to that side of it.
Thanks. So we've had a few questions in that look at fieldwork as an environment in which we can see an increased risk of sexual assault or sexual harassment. So I guess a question for those of you leading fieldwork, do you feel that your university has trained you or has procedures to handle that? And if not, how do we get that in place very quickly?
Now you mention it, I don't know if I've had any formal training as a field trip leader beyond physical first aid. Now we put together a risk assessment which covers all the standard stuff, how far is it to the hospital, blah, 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 blah. But I don't think I've ever had anything which has been more nuanced than that, which would take into, I guess mental health first aid training is, you're required, I think, to state whether there is a mental health first aid trained person on the field trip. But in terms of sexual harassment, I don't know if there's anything specific within the risk assessment that would be specific over and above anything which was a general policy around sexual harassment that would cover the whole institution, if that makes sense. I don't know. I'm sort of looking at the panel and the chat, but I'm not sure. I've never seen it. I've handled situations where it's happened, but that's only because I was, you know, again, it was a live situation, but I don't think anybody said this is what you should do to de-escalate this situation, but you know, the same way you would if somebody broken their legs, you stabilize, you do, you know. Do we have that? Are we aware of that, anybody?
I mean, we've had general training. I mean, it's been available, but I mean, I can only speak from Leeds. But that it's not to do with fieldwork, it's not to do with geology. It's, you know, about if somebody discloses to you something. So that's along those lines. I suspect that is available elsewhere, but certainly not. I think with fieldwork, there's so many things that we don't think about, you know, that could potentially come up on fieldwork. You know, some of the stuff we've been discussing today, I thought, oh yeah, hadn't thought of that one. It's almost like you need to make a list of everything to think about and then look at how we can, you know, go around addressing, you know, the different potential for things that could happen.
I guess this might be the time to bring up the elephant in the room of alcohol on fieldwork. And I know for the US, it was a lot easier because most of us were not of legal drinking age, so it couldn't happen. But in Europe and everywhere else, everyone would legally be able to drink. And certainly it's come up a lot in terms of conferences. So yeah, just how do we deal with that? And then I realized we're running out of time, so we'll have to wrap this up. But is there a way to encourage responsible alcohol consumption when we're in the field? Anyone on that one? Mike?
So this has been a long debate, and there's been so when I worked for the British Antarctic Survey, this was quite a big debate, because not only is the issue of people drinking alcohol in Antarctica, but there's also this sort of logistical cost. People say, well, why are you even bringing this? You know, what's the value in having it? And I think it does help, but the value is you're going to deal with people coming from a drinking culture in the UK, unfortunately. And so it's better to have it in a way that it's controlled and managed than to ban it and then have people drink underground. So I think my suggestion to people running student field trips, and I'm interested to hear the other panelists' suggestion on this, is that I would plan a field trip around the idea that there are two social strands each evening. There is a drinking strand and a not drinking strand, and you could call them something else. And everyone was expected to go to the non-drinking strand at least once, and see how that played out. I know in the Arctic station in Svalbard, they had quite a clever system, which essentially was that you had to buy your drinks from the station commander, and you could only draw the money to buy those drinks from the commander earlier in the day. So there was a limit to how much you could have, and that worked surprisingly well. Nick Cox, who runs the Arctic station, is the master of that.
That was brilliant. I don't know. I think you can sort of advise people what to do. And I think Mike's right. You know, there is a culture clash in a sense that, you know, I would like to have a drink. I think the only thing from a field trip leader's point of view is you can style your behavior as you would wish the students maybe to follow. So you model that behavior around, a relative, because there are the stories of the field trip leaders who are playing drinking games all night and taking the students on the beach for skinny dipping and stuff. And, I think, inboard of that, there's like a couple of glasses of wine over dinner and then to bed, so there is a behavior set, which if you style that, then maybe it percolates through. I think the other thing is repercussions for transgressions. During the field course perhaps, but also at Imperial there's this situation a few years ago when in Spain there was a fight between the locals and a substantial part of the student body. I don't know if you heard about that, and the police were called and people ended up in prison, and it was a big mess, and they were banned from the hotel eventually. but, you know, making sure that those students were punished and that it percolated down to the years below was an important outcome of that, I think.
One of the things we do is try and push professional standards, you know, and make that point. It's fine to have a drink, but we expect you to maintain, you know, professional standards at all times, you know, so but it is incredibly difficult. It is incredibly difficult, particularly where you do have young people away from home for the first time. You're taking them out into a strange environment. If anyone has any good solutions, but I mean, this is, yeah, as I said, this is what we try and do is push professional standards. We have sort of thought about whether those could be, you know, implemented within, it's like what Chris was saying there about consequences and having like professional points as part of the module. So actually linking it in with the mark that they will get from module. We've not done that. I understand some places have considered that or have done that before now. It's there, it's something that we're thinking about.
I think as we're running out of time, I might go around the panel and see if you have anything you want to say before we wrap this up. I'm so sorry to all the people who have questions that we didn't get to, and I was worried maybe we wouldn't have a vibrant Q&A, but turns out it was wonderful. Please watch this space. It's quite clear that there's so much that we all need to be doing as a community. So I think the Geological Society and Dig UK will have a lot to say on this in the future. I guess, shall I go in reverse order? And Louisa, would you like to have your last few concluding statements?
Well, just thank you, everyone, both Alicia, Geological Society, and all the panelists and all the people participating actively in the chat. This is encouraging. I know there's a lot of things to improve, but it's very good that also, even though it's challenging with these virtual environments, it's this type of remote video calls allow us to have conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise. And I would we have access to the questions afterwards? So maybe we can answer them.
Yes, I think I can download it. Possibly. I'll stare at my computer screen once everyone has been done.
Thanks.
Oh, Mike, I think that's you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, again, thank you for having me. It's been a really interesting conversation. I just wanted to pick up one question I've just seen pick up in the chat from Nicholas Barber, talking about the challenge of doing fieldwork in a rural area and how the issues around more subtle discriminatory issues, which I think is a really valid point. I think the key thing is to not to brush it under the carpet and discuss it in advance. And I know we've had one or two students in Cardiff in the past who have been made to feel very uncomfortable whilst on a field trip, and then not known who to talk to and felt very isolated. So yeah, think about it in advance and talk to people around it, around that idea. In some cases, one of my colleagues was involved in doing field work in rural South Africa, and they took the step of actually writing on the university's letterhead to the local landowners saying, we're bringing a party of students to your land to the area near your land on these dates, so that the local people knew what to expect. And that's a good technique to take forward. But thank you all very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Hi, yeah. My last comment, I guess, is something which has been bubbling around in my gut for like the last couple of years of discussing this. I don't want anybody to go away from this thinking people who are talking about inclusivity in geoscience fieldwork want to ban and end fieldwork. I think everybody on this call is incredibly passionate about fieldwork and we see huge value in it. And this is why we're being so noisy and uncompromising in our efforts to make it more accessible. I don't want people to think and I do not care if your institution is pressurizing you to reduce the amount of fieldwork or whatever, to reduce costs. This does not give us a free pass on making fieldwork less accessible and in fact more dangerous for certain people. So we have to balance those two things.
Cheers coming in on the chat. Jackie, last words? Oh, final.
Yeah,
statements, sorry.
Yeah, I can just totally echo what Chris says there. You know, fieldwork is just brilliant. It's incredibly important, you know, and we can make it inclusive. It's just a case of, you know, thinking about it. One of the things that I never got a chance to say was that you can actually, you know, do a mixed style or what we call a hybrid field trip, where, you know, perhaps we take a, you know, a student who can't climb the highest mountain, but we would like to go up to that highest mountain, if you see what I mean, is give them a, you know, really good, you can give people a good alternative as well. You know, it can be, you know, if you've collected rocks from the, you know, that highest mountain, and give them a, you know, a proper alternative that they can be doing, or they can be working with colleagues, you know, via GoPros or even drones. I've heard of a student with a drone. There is so much we can do. And I appreciate there are costs involved, but a lot of it is just thinking ahead and planning, actually, what can we do here? Because also it comes back to some of those things you plan can actually be rainy day exercises as well. So they double up, they are useful. So it's amazing what you can do, how you can get people into the field and how brilliant that is. But yeah, it's just communication and planning.
Great, well, thank you so much. And I think, just to sum up, fieldwork is so important, but if someone's uncomfortable or not accommodated, their learning just won't happen in the same way as if they were fully immersed. And so it's up to all of us to just make sure everyone can come as their fully authentic self and learn in a safe and supportive environment, because we all know how wonderful fieldwork is and just want to make sure everyone can experience it. So please keep watching this space. It's clear that there's so much we have to talk about and do here. And yeah, we'll try and pick it up soon. So thank you everyone who's joined us. Thank you again to the wonderful panelists, and have a wonderful evening or whatever time it is where you are.